The Amazon basin does not begin at a single point. It expands gradually, without boundary markers or clear transitions, until roads give way to soil, and soil gives way to water. The air changes first. It thickens. Movement slows. Sound travels differently. From above, it appears continuous. A green surface without interruption. Rivers cut through it, but even they seem absorbed into the whole. Depth is difficult to measure. Distance becomes unreliable. On the ground, orientation is limited. Visibility narrows to a few meters in most directions. Light filters through layers of canopy, diffused and inconsistent. The forest floor remains damp, regardless of recent rain. Decay and growth exist at the same time, in the same space. There are no natural vantage points. The Amazon does not resist entry. It allows it. Quietly. Without warning. What it removes is not access, but reference. Direction becomes uncertain. Time becomes difficult to track. Small decisions carry weight, though this is not immediately obvious. If you continue watching, you will see how quickly that shift can happen, how a person moves from observation to dependence, and from dependence to risk, often without recognizing the transition as it occurs. For now, there is no urgency here. Only scale. And the absence of edges. In 1981, a young Israeli traveler named Yossi Ginsberg arrived in South America after completing his mandatory military service. He was in his early 20s. Like many others moving through the continent at the time, he was drawn by distance, by unfamiliar landscapes, and by the possibility of experience outside structured environments. He traveled through several countries before reaching Bolivia. In the city of La Paz, he met two other travelers, Kevin Gale, from the United States, and Marcus Stam, from Switzerland. The three formed a temporary partnership, shaped more by proximity and shared direction than long-term planning. They were later joined by a fourth man, Karl Rupprechter, who presented himself as an experienced guide familiar with the Amazon region. He spoke of remote villages, uncontacted tribes, and routes that extended deep into the rainforest. His descriptions were specific enough to be convincing, though not verifiable. The group made a decision to follow him. Preparation was limited. Equipment was basic. Maps, if present, were incomplete. Their understanding of the terrain came largely from Karl's accounts. There was no formal route plan, no external support, and no reliable means of communication once they entered the forest. They traveled north, away from urban centers, toward the edges of the Amazon rainforest. The transition was gradual. Roads narrowed, then disappeared. Settlements became less frequent. Eventually, the structure of travel gave way to movement on foot. The group dynamics began to shift early. Marcus struggled physically. The pace was demanding, and the conditions, humidity, insects, and constant exposure, created strain. Kevin showed signs of concern about the reliability of their guide. Yossi, by contrast, remained committed to continuing. The idea of reaching a remote destination, of seeing something few others had seen, held its weight. Karl maintained control of direction. Days passed without clear progress markers. The forest remained consistent in all directions. Rivers appeared and disappeared. Trails were faint or non-existent. Food sources were uncertain. What had initially been presented as a guided expedition began to resemble an extended movement without verification. At a certain point, the group divided. Marcus and Karl chose to turn back, aiming to exit the forest along a different path. Yossi and Kevin decided to continue forward, following the river system that Karl had previously described as a route deeper into the jungle. There was no formal agreement. No structured plan for regrouping. Only a separation, made in place, under pressure. From that moment, the margin for error narrowed. The forest did not change. But their position within it did. The river offered direction where the forest did not. After separating from Karl Rupprechter and Marcus Stam, Yossi Ginsberg and Kevin Gale continued along a tributary system connected to the Tucci River. It moved steadily through dense terrain, cutting a visible path forward. The assumption was simple: follow the current, and it would eventually lead to habitation. Walking along its edge proved inconsistent. The banks shifted between mud, rock, and thick vegetation. Progress was slow. At times, the river curved back on itself, creating the illusion of movement without distance. They made a decision to build a raft. The construction was improvised. Materials were gathered from the immediate surroundings: branches, vines, and what limited rope they carried. It was not engineered for stability over long distances, only for flotation. The river appeared calm in sections. That assessment did not extend far beyond their line of sight. They entered the water without a secondary plan. For a period, the raft held. Movement became faster. The banks passed more quickly than they had on foot. The forest, from the water, seemed to open slightly. Visibility improved, though only in one direction. Then the current changed. The river narrowed. The surface became uneven. What had appeared as a manageable flow developed into a series of rapids. There was no clear exit point along the banks. The raft, not designed for impact, began to lose structure under pressure. Control was limited. At a certain point, the raft broke apart. Both men entered the water. The current separated them within seconds. Visibility dropped immediately. The noise of the river masked any attempt at communication. Each was carried in a different direction, without the ability to correct course. Yossi Ginsberg was forced downstream. When he reached the bank, he was alone. There was no immediate sign of Kevin Gale. No equipment had remained intact beyond what he carried on his body. The river continued moving, unchanged by the event. At that moment, the structure of the journey ended. There was no longer a shared direction. No guide. No confirmation of location. Only the forest, the river, and a single point of survival. Alone on the bank of the Tucci River, Yossi Ginsberg faced the first practical challenge: movement. The river flowed steadily, but the banks were inconsistent: mud, fallen trees, tangled roots. Each step required careful attention. Misjudgment could mean slipping into the current again, with unknown consequences. He began walking parallel to the river, attempting to follow its course downstream. The forest around him remained dense, layered with vegetation that obscured distance. Visibility rarely exceeded a few meters. The canopy filtered sunlight into irregular patches. Sound traveled oddly, the rush of the river drowned most subtle cues. Occasionally, he would hear birds or distant animal calls, but they offered no guidance. Hunger developed early. He had little food, some dried provisions from the raft and a small amount of chocolate, but it was insufficient. He experimented with local fruits and plants, relying on observation and the minimal knowledge he carried. Some were safe, some produced minor digestive discomfort. The jungle was indifferent to trial and error. Insects and other small threats were constant. Mosquitoes, ants, and leeches were pervasive. Physical discomfort compounded psychological stress. Each night required finding or constructing a rudimentary shelter, often under branches or within dense foliage, to avoid exposure to rain and insects. Fire was attempted repeatedly, though the damp environment made ignition slow and uncertain. Water was abundant but not guaranteed safe. Streams and river sections were collected selectively. Boiling was impossible without consistent fuel and fire, so he relied on judgment, avoiding stagnant pools. Yossi kept moving. Distance was measured by effort rather than landmarks. Sometimes the forest looped, rivers curved back, and he found himself near areas he thought he had passed. Direction was relative, time arbitrary. He marked trees with crude scratches when possible, though the humid environment often erased them within hours. Physical fatigue accumulated rapidly. Muscles and joints ached from uneven terrain. He developed a careful rhythm, move during daylight, rest at night. Sleep was light, interrupted by sounds of the forest. Constant vigilance became necessary. A single misstep could lead to injury, which could prove critical in isolation. Psychologically, he adopted observation as a strategy. The jungle was large and indifferent. Panic or overexertion could be fatal. He monitored his responses, keeping motion measured, rationing attention as much as food. After several days, patterns emerged. Certain areas of the river provided easier travel, small clearings offered temporary refuge, particular plants could supplement meager rations. Still, there was no certainty, only adaptation. The forest remained unyielding, but predictability and routine provided a fragile sense of control. By the end of the first week, he had traveled kilometers yet remained uncertain of position. Each day, the jungle reinforced both his isolation and the necessity of discipline. This was no adventure as initially imagined. Survival required constant assessment, patience, and restraint. The river that had seemed a guide became merely one of many factors in navigation and sustenance. And yet, moving without direction was moving at all. Progress, however undefined, was essential to remain alive. As days extended into more than a week, Yossi Ginsberg began to formalize his approach to survival. The rainforest presented constant pressure. The initial novelty of being alone in such an environment had passed, replaced by the practical reality of sustaining life. Shelter was improvised from what the jungle offered. Fallen branches formed the basic structure, with leaves and palm fronds providing coverage from rain. Rain fell frequently, often in sudden bursts. Each night required reconstruction of these temporary structures, and each night brought the cold dampness that sapped energy. Fire remained a challenge. Striking flint against a stone or rubbing materials together sometimes produced sparks, but damp conditions often extinguished flames. The ability to maintain warmth became a recurring concern, particularly during early mornings. Water was abundant but required judgment. He learned to collect from flowing streams rather than stagnant pools to reduce exposure to parasites. Rainwater was captured on large leaves when possible. The constant humidity minimized thirst, but dehydration remained a latent threat, particularly under physical exertion. Food required cautious experimentation. Insects, small crustaceans, and edible plants became primary sources. He avoided unknown fruits unless they matched basic survival guides he had memorized. Occasional fish were caught by hand or using improvised tools, though success was limited. Every meal, however small, became a victory for continuity. Nutrition was never adequate, yet the body adapted incrementally. Movement continued, but it was methodical rather than hurried. Paths were chosen to avoid unnecessary exertion, and the river remained a reference point despite its indirect course. He marked trees with crude symbols when feasible, attempting to maintain a mental map of areas already traveled. Errors were inevitable, but repetition and observation created patterns he could exploit. Mental discipline was equally essential. Loneliness pressed in during quiet periods. The forest produced shadows and sounds that demanded attention. He maintained routines, fire attempts, rationing, observation, and movement, that grounded his day and preserved cognitive function. Hallucinations were rare at first, but constant vigilance against fatigue became a strategy. Sleep was short but structured. He avoided long rest periods that could reduce alertness or allow for accidental injury. Insects, snakes, and unknown animals remained constant presence. Each encounter required caution. Simple misjudgment could result in bites or injury, potentially fatal without care. Clothing became worn and torn, exposing him to minor cuts and insect bites, each a persistent reminder of vulnerability. Over 2 weeks, his body weakened, yet he maintained adaptive behaviors. Muscle soreness, blisters, and hunger were managed through pacing and rationing. The forest forced humility, survival demanded observation, patience, and resilience rather than speed or force. He began to rely on memory and instinct. Recognizing edible plants, recalling river landmarks, and interpreting animal tracks became central to decision-making. Each day reinforced both the scale of the Amazon and the limited margin within which survival existed. By the end of the second week, survival had become procedural. Every decision, from when to move to when to rest, had consequences. Mistakes could be fatal. Yet the discipline he had developed allowed continued existence, each day a quiet affirmation of endurance rather than triumph. By the third week, the cumulative strain on Yossi Ginsberg became visible. His body, already weakened by limited nutrition and constant exertion, showed signs of progressive fatigue. Skin was sunburned and scratched, muscles stiff, joints swollen from repetitive movement and exposure. Minor injuries, blisters, cuts, and insect bites, began to take longer to heal, leaving him increasingly vulnerable to infection. Sleep remained inconsistent. Nights were punctuated by sudden rainstorms, animal sounds, and the damp cold of the jungle floor. The constant vigilance required to maintain shelter and avoid hazards disrupted rest cycles. Fatigue blurred perception. Time became less meaningful. Days and nights merged into a continuous sequence of movement, observation, and survival effort. Food scarcity compounded the physical decline. Edible fruits had been partially exhausted, and small animals were difficult to capture. Calories were insufficient to sustain normal energy levels. Hunger was persistent, gnawing, yet managed through rationing and cautious selection of available sources. Each intake, no matter how small, was deliberate, measured, and mentally accounted for. Mental strain intensified. Isolation amplified awareness of every minor sound and movement. The forest's density, previously navigated with cautious observation, now produced illusions and heightened tension. Brief hallucinations, shapes, movement, or imagined voices, occurred during moments of fatigue. Awareness of mortality became sharper. The reality of injury, exhaustion, and continued isolation pressed heavily. Environmental hazards persisted. Sudden river currents, slippery mud, and overhanging branches created continuous risk. Minor missteps could have catastrophic consequences. Each day required careful attention to avoid compounding the physical toll. The cumulative effect of physical and psychological strain began to alter behavior. Decisions became more conservative. Movement slowed. Risk was minimized. Effort was allocated almost exclusively to immediate survival rather than exploration or orientation. Despite the deterioration, adaptive behaviors remained. Shelter construction, water collection, and food foraging continued. Fire was maintained when possible, though often marginal. Survival routines persisted, a fragile framework against the persistent pressure of the rainforest. The third week marked the limits of human endurance in isolation. Fatigue, hunger, and uncertainty combined into a constant presence. Progress along the river was slow. Each day required deliberate calculation, restraint, and observation. The jungle had not changed, yet the margin for error had narrowed dramatically. Survival was no longer a matter of skill alone. It relied on discipline, patience, and the quiet acceptance of hardship. The forest's indifference remained unchanged. Yossi's condition, however, revealed the exacting cost of existing within it. After 3 weeks of isolation, Yossi Ginsberg was discovered by Kevin Gale. Kevin had not immediately known where Yossi had gone after their separation on the river, but he returned to search along the tributary system they had followed. His movements were informed by the fragments of landmarks, river bends, and recollections of their journey. The moment of contact was quiet and unceremonious. Yossi was found weak, dirty, and malnourished. His clothes were torn, and his body bore the marks of weeks in the jungle. There was no celebration. No expression of relief beyond the simple recognition of another human presence. Basic assessment followed. Yossi was conscious, oriented, and able to walk slowly with support. Immediate priorities were water, rest, and extraction from the most difficult sections of the riverbank. Kevin assisted in carrying him over obstacles, maintaining a steady pace without rushing. The forest remained unchanged. Rain, humidity, and insects continued as they had throughout the preceding weeks. The environment offered no acknowledgement of rescue or survival, only continuity. Yossi's survival, now confirmed, was the result of sustained discipline, adaptive behavior, and endurance. The contact with Kevin marked the transition from isolation to assistance, from complete vulnerability to the presence of aid. No words were necessary beyond the practical. Survival had been maintained, quietly, against the ongoing, unyielding conditions of the Amazon. The forest remained unchanged after Yossi Ginsberg's rescue. The trees, rivers, and undergrowth continued their indifferent cycles. The scale of the Amazon, its density, and its quiet persistence were untouched by human survival or presence. For those who study such events, the story emphasizes the interplay of preparation, discipline, and endurance. Individual decisions, awareness of environment, and adaptive behavior determined the outcome. Chance played a role, but the framework of survival was built on observation and consistent action. Yossi's experience remains a reference point in historical accounts of jungle survival, a demonstration of human resilience within extreme isolation. The forest itself was neither friend nor foe, it was a context that required respect, knowledge, and patience. The Amazon did not change for Yossi. He emerged from it alive, carrying lessons in restraint, discipline, and the quiet limits of human endurance. And in the absence of drama, the rainforest continued, vast, uninterrupted, and without edges.